Welcome to another responsive design video. In this video I'm going to talk about the grid layout. Grid layout is a simplified way of making modular or multi-column layouts. If you haven't watched all of my videos so far on how to make multi-column layouts using floats and clears and all that kind of garbage, you need to go back and watch that because you need to have a good handle on how content boxes in HTML work, and you have to have a good context for understanding why this is so much more powerful than using floats and clears. Alright, I presume that you've watched all that stuff. If you haven't, watch at your own peril. In order to do this video, you should have an HTML file set up for you. You want to have your HTML file start off with a header. Basically, this is going to be the same type of layout that we've been using in all of my videos going all the way back to the beginning. You've got your header, nav, content, footer, stack. So your header, probably going to have an H1 with some content in it. Your nav is going to have a UL with some LIs and links with the A tag. And that's going to be right underneath the header. Right below the nav, you're going to open a new div. And we're going to call this div content wrapper or content wrap. Okay, so div class content wrap. That content wrapper is going to be our container for the grid. It's going to be the thing that's going to be the grid, and it's going to allow things to be laid out using the grid property. Inside of that div called content wrap, we're going to have two child divs, or two child content boxes. I'm going to use an element called main, which is something I haven't talked about yet. It is a semantic element from HTML5 that is going to work, it's going to work kind of like a div. It's an unstyled element, but instead of a div being non-semantic and semantic neutral, in other words, div just means division of space, well, main is semantic. It's meant to be used with your main content on the page. So I'm calling it main, and I'm going to call it main class main content. All right? Inside of the main content, we're going to put a series of articles, and those articles are going to have H2s and paragraphs, just like we've always done. So maybe article times 3, and those articles are each going to have an H2 and a series of paragraphs. So maybe 3 paragraphs each. So your main content class is going to have articles, 3 of them, with an H2 and 3 paragraphs each. All right, that's going to be your main content, and it's going to be inside of the content wrap. Below the main, inside the content wrap, we're going to make a section, and we're going to call it sidebar. Okay? In that section, you can make a series of articles or a series of other sections. I recommend using sections, so maybe make like 3 or 4 sections, and inside of those sections I put some images in there. So I put figure with img and fig captions, and I think I made like 5 or 6 of those sections. If you do 3 or 4, that's totally fine. But what we're really concerned with is that you've got a div called content wrap, and you've got 2 other containers inside there that are directly in that content wrap div. This is going to be our grid, and it needs to have a number of children, a number of things nested inside it for the grid to work. So down below these, this is where we close the content wrap. All right, so this both contained inside the content wrap, and below that, footer. All right, so I want you to pause the video, make your markup really quickly, just get your HTML, make sure it's clean, make sure it looks, with this kind of structure. If you have this structure, then this is going to work. The big thing is just make sure, if you want it to work just like mine, make sure your container div is called content wrap, and you've got 2 children nested inside of it. You can call them whatever you want. They could be whatever you want. They just have to be nested inside of the div called content wrap for this to work. So go out, write your HTML, and come on back. Welcome back. Hopefully you've got good HTML. If you don't, you may have to pause and fix some things. So I'm going to just really quickly go over the HTML so you can see it. I added a page wrapper, which is something that you've seen me do in most of my videos going all the way back to the very beginning. So it's div class page wrapper. It opens above the header, closes below the footer. Inside the content wrapper, I've got all of my page content. I've got my header with an H1. I've got my nav with a UL and a series of LIs that have links in them. Nav closes. Right below the nav, I've got my div called content wrap. So I said that before. This is going to be our grid container. Content wrap is going to contain my main. This is my main content. I use the element main. I call it class main-content. And as I said before, you're going to have a series of articles. So I've got an article with H2 and a series of paragraphs. And I think I've got 3 of them in here. Okay? And then that main closes right here. So the main is wrapping up 3 articles, each with some paragraphs and an H2. Then I've got a section called sidebar, and the section called sidebar, as I said, is going to contain a series of sections. And the section here is called class add content. I don't care what you call it, I don't care what you do with it, it doesn't really matter, because all of this stuff is just going to be beholden to the grid. They're going to have to behave like the grid tells them to behave. But I've just, created sections, gave them a class name, put figures in them, and a fig caption and an image. Okay, and I did 4 or 5 of them. It doesn't matter how many you make, it's just content that has to be in our sidebar. And my sidebar section closes right here. And this is where my content wrapper closes. Okay, so the content wrapper, as I said, wraps up my 2 nested elements. In this case, I've got a main and a section, and those things contain their own content. Below the content wrapper, I've got my footer. So in previous videos, we styled these things by using floats and clears. And one of the things that was kind of a pain about this is that we had to do some calculations, and you had to figure out the total widths of all those content boxes that needed to be columns. So my main and my sidebar are my 2 columns. I'd have to give them a set width. Then I would set their margins and paddings and borders. Then I would have to add up all those things in the content boxes and make sure they equal up to exactly 100% or just under 100%. And if they go over, those columns break. We've seen this before. Well, the cool thing about grid is we don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. A lot of those types of calculations are going to be done innately with the grid technology. So let's take a look at how it works. So as I said, my content wrap class, or my content wrap div, is going to be my grid container. Every grid layout needs a grid container. So I'll go dot content wrap, and I'm going to use the display property and the grid value. All right? Now if I save this and run it, you're going to see that it's just going to look like a regular old page. It's not going to actually conform to a grid yet. So you can see all of my figures and fig captions. Got my footer, I've got my main content, my nav, and my header, but it doesn't look like anything yet. Kind of like with when we did floats and clears, you had to float everything, you had to set their widths. If you didn't set their widths, even if they're floated, they're still not going to be columns. Well, this needs to have another step. So I'm going to use the property grid template columns. Grid template columns. And what this does, it's going to set up a template for how these columns are going to behave. And we have to put in some values in here. We could do things like, I could put in 125px, and then do something like 1fr. And I'll talk about what an FR is in a little bit. But what I've done is I've set up some proportions and sizes for my 2 columns. This is my first column, this is my second column. And for the number of arguments that you have in here in this value, they have to match the number of children that you have on that grid container. So my grid container is the parent here, content wrap, and I've got two children. I've got my main called main content, and I've got my section called sidebar. Those are the children that are directly nested inside of the content wrap. So since I've got two children directly in there, I have to put two values right here. So I'm setting it to 125 pixels and 1 FR. I gotta save it, and let's take a look at what it looks like in the browser now. Okay, so you can see that it's in two columns. I've got the left column here, which is 125 pixels wide, and I've got this other column here, which is taking up the rest of the space. This doesn't look like a very good layout to me. I don't like it, but you can see right now that I've got two columns. Now, I didn't have to do any calculations. I didn't have to do any figuring of sizes like we did before, and there's only 2 lines of code that makes this 2-column layout. It's very powerful in comparison to what we did before. Before, you had to set both of those the column divs that we wanted to float left. You had to set their sizes. You had to set their, talk about all of their box model properties like margin and padding and all that kind of stuff. Well, we don't have to worry about that stuff here. We just have to set our sizes for these. Now let's talk about what the FR is. We know what PX is, it's for pixels, but FR is a fractional unit. What it does is it looks at all remaining available space in your grid, and it divides it up into fractions. Since this is 1 FR, it's going to take up 100% of the rest of that space. Now let's try something here. I'm going to go 1 FR, 1 FR. I'll save it, look at it in the browser, and now I've got a 1-to-1 ratio here. They're both the same width for those two columns. Pretty cool. If I wanted to have my main wider than my sidebar, which is what I want to do, I might go like a 2-to-1. So this is going to be 2 times that, and that's going to be 1 times. Oh, well, this isn't working. I forgot to do one thing. So I've got to set my images. My images aren't flexible right now. So I'm just going to go img, just so these things behave. I still forget to do things when I'm moving fast. I'll go max width, 100%, so that they'll always only be 100% of the width of their container. And now this thing will behave the way it should. There we go. This is what I wanted to see. So I've got my 2-to-1 here. This is 2 times as wide as this column. Now there's one more thing that I want to show you in this video with the grid layout. It's called grid gap. And grid gap talks about the spaces in between the columns and the rows. I'm just going to start it by going 5%, something pretty big so that you can see a real change here. It put a 5% gap right in between these two columns. Okay? You can set that to whatever you want. I'm going to set it down to 2 because that's going to look a little bit better with this. And there we go. And I've got a 2% gap in between these two columns. Well, there you have it, folks. This is the very basics of the grid. What it comes down to is this is a very powerful modular layout tool. And it's so much simpler than the old way of doing things. I did that 2-column layout with, standard HTML that I would always use, and then 3 lines of CSS. Display grid, that has to be on some sort of grid container. Grid template columns, and then give it a couple values, and then grid gap. In future videos, I'd like you to tune in to learn how to make rows and columns to make more complex layouts. And then after that, that's going to be a good jumping point for you to learn all the different ways that the grid property can work. There's so many ways to set up your layouts with grids. It's an incredibly powerful tool. Start using it now. get to know it really well, and become flexible with it, and you'll be able to make fantastic responsive designs. Thanks for watching.